To our webinar for Education Now. My name is Francesca Purcell. I'll be your host today, and we are going to start things off in just another minute or so until we get a few more folks in. So just give us another moment, and then we'll start things off. All right. Well, it looks like we have a good crowd that's here. So let me officially welcome all of you for taking the time and thanking you for taking the time today to join us at Harvard Graduate Schools of Education's Education Now webinar. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're calling in from. Again, my name is Francesca Purcell, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Higher Education Program at HGSE. The Education Now webinar series is designed to respond to the changes in the field of education, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And for today, we're going to have a conversation where we're talking about the disruptions impacting high school students as they consider applying to and enrolling in college. We're going to talk about and look at what counselors, educators, and parents should be doing to assist, and what college officials should be prepared to do to support this generation of students in their transition from high school. Just so you know, today's episode is being recorded and will be available to view on the Harvard Education YouTube channel and Facebook page. And you could also visit the Education Now website for recordings and information about future episodes. During the last 10 minutes of our 30-minute webinar, you'll be able to submit questions that we'll be able to take some of them, and the Q&A button is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, let me take a moment to greet our guests and to welcome them. So we have with us today Leah Escalera, who is the Vice Provost for Academic Support Services and Undergraduate Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Prior to this, Leah has held numerous leadership roles at Bunker Hill Community College and other higher education institutions in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Leah, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We also have with us today Richard Gordon. Richard is the principal of Paul Robeson High School for Human Services, which is located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I'm happy to say that Richard was named the 2021 National Principal of the Year by the National Association of Secondary School Principals. So Richard, congratulations on that and welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Francesca, for having me.
And finally, I want to welcome my colleague, Mandy Savitz-Romer, who is here with me at HGSE. Mandy is the Fortsheimer Aronson Senior Lecturer in Human Development and Education and Faculty Director of the Prevention Science and Practice Program. Mandy's area of study links research to practice in the field of school counseling, specifically as it relates to college access and retention for urban students. So again, welcome Leah, Richard, and Mandy. Very happy to have you with us today. So
to be here.
Let me start things off by saying, and recently we've had information come out from the National Student Clearinghouse where we've seen a tremendous dip in enrollment in colleges and universities nationally. There had been for about 10 years a slow decline in enrollment, about 1% annually, but in the last couple of years, we've seen almost 7% drop, which translates into over 1.2 million fewer students in our colleges and universities nationally. And within that, some sectors are being hit harder than others. So we see, for example, community colleges have experienced a 13% decline in enrollments during the pandemic, but many four-year institutions, particularly open access four-year institutions, have also seen significant drops. And we know these institutions serve a disproportionately high fraction of students from low-income backgrounds, BIPOC students, first-gen, and adult students. So for the students in these communities and for the educators and the staff at the high schools, colleges, and universities that serve them, this has been an extraordinarily challenging time with potentially long-term adverse consequences. So I'm so happy that we have the three of you on board to help us think through and work through some ways forward. So Richard, I'm going to sort of start this conversation with you and invite Lee and Mandy to come in. But one of the key issues we've seen coming up is that around mental health challenges for our students and frankly for staff as well. And in this day and age, how do you think about what college counseling should look like, what student support should look like, the college admissions process? How can that be basically a more humane process for our students? What is it that, how do you diagnose this and how do you see some ways forward about what you're doing?
Wow. There are a number of challenges, but the number one thing that I've seen so far is that the pandemic has really given us an opportunity to kind of peer deeply into what's happening behind the scenes into the family homes of a lot of our students. There's a lot of dysfunction. There's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of trauma that's not been dealt with. I know for our school in particular, we've always had a trauma program, but we had to add a second one just so that we can kind of really differentiate between having low, the lower intense cases versus the higher intense cases. So in other words, it's somebody getting, weekly therapy versus someone who might be, having suicidal ideations, for example, or in some cases, kids who've had attempts. And so we had to expand our mental health services for students on a regular basis because we've seen a lot of emotional outbursts that have come from students. And not just students that a lot of times you can identify, which students are having challenges, but also what about those students that normally would be your high flyers that are now also starting to experience these challenges that come out of the blue. So that's been a huge thing. But I was thinking about, your opening remarks about what's happening with the college matriculation with our students. And one of the biggest things that I think that we're trying to get really our city here in Philadelphia to talk more about and address more about is about what's happening with poverty here in the city of Philadelphia. We are one of the largest big city most impoverished big cities in America. We were always top 10. I think we were number one a couple of years ago. I know that we're kind of vying back and forth with Detroit at the moment. And so that poverty issue is a huge deal because it's not only impeding why students are not matriculating to college, but also it's impacting our completion rate as well. So when you take a look at the poverty issue along with that and how that poverty issue is gleaning a lot of the mental health issues as well, what you're finding is that our kids are not only matriculating, but even when they do, they don't get an opportunity to complete college as well. So they wind up dropping out after the first semester, if not during the course of the first year. Less than 13% of Philadelphians have a college degree of any kind. So a lot of times our students, when they go off to college, they return back home and they're here for, amount of time. Yeah, people do move out of town, but for the most part, our kids come back home and then less than 13% earn a degree. So we have to start addressing the issue of what's happening with trauma and expanding those trauma services, not just in their personal lives, but also on college campuses and in our high schools a lot sooner. And then start taking a look at the poverty issue. What can we do to kind of aid students a lot more financially to support their, not just in matriculation, but also how to keep them in school and keep them, completing through at this point. I know that we're associated with Community College of Philadelphia that has a scholarship that's actually allowing students to complete college free of charge. And so that's taking a lot of financial burden and stress off a lot of our students. So we're seeing that that's one measure that's starting to help.
Great. Let me invite Mandy and Leah if you want to weigh in on this question around mental health. And now Richard's brought in these, larger, super important issues around poverty and greater support services. Mandy?
Yeah, Francesca, I appreciate that you started with mental health. I think for too long we considered college planning and readiness and mental health two very different things. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, just announced that the mental health crisis is our health crisis among our youth right now. And what that means is that when folks in high schools are trying to talk with students about planning for their futures, we have to bear in mind that they are not necessarily prioritizing college planning. Our young people may be still grieving from the loss of a loved one from COVID. They may be contributing financially to their families due to job loss, or maybe themselves, they're trying to find a way out of depression that has been spurred on by much of the social isolation that the pandemic brought on. So I think we have to start from a place in which we understand that college counseling today includes trying to understand where young people are, and that ultimately we may have to address some of their basic needs before we can engage in the kinds of what used to be more transactional, more sort of like, let me help you fill out an application, let me help you look at schools. We have to start from a very different place right now and understand where students are. And that means recognizing that even the students who were previously high achieving and seemed very on top of things, that they are also struggling. They may have better coping mechanisms. They may be kind of adapting better to it, but they're struggling also. And so I think we start by assuming that not all the kids are okay, and that we have to really use a much more integrated approach where we're starting with students and figuring out what their needs are right now.
Great, thanks, Mandy. Leah, I see you shaking your head a lot, sort of in agreement. Do you want to add a few things from a post-secondary perspective?
You know, I think there are a lot of parallels across our systems of areas that we need to address. I think in higher education in particular, we really like to compartmentalize. We like to have specialties and micro specialties and really narrow work into these areas that become disjointed. And I think we're making an assumption that as students travel across our campuses and have a series of interactions, that it's adding up to something holistic for them, when we're really not being intentional in most places about creating a holistic model that's student-centered. I think we have a long way to go on most campuses. And I think really partnering with our K-12 partners, really starting looking at the whole spectrum, and partnering with our community organizations, because many of our public institutions are serving adult student populations. Our community colleges and public institutions in Boston certainly are serving some direct high school graduates, but most who are not direct high school graduates, and the levels of adult development needs change related to mental health. So I think we really have to start engaging in conversation across the educational sector and with community partners who are embedded where our students live and access services already, so that we can really understand the problem and we can develop holistic collaborative interventions.
Great, thanks, Leah. So let me sort of go with this theme that you all have raised about, moving on from mental health as well as other obstacles. One of the pieces that we certainly are aware of is that students have bounced back a lot and forth from online learning to in-person, in mass, not mass, back and forth, up and down and around. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about some of the ways, and I think, Richard, we'll start with you again, that you've sort of been able to work with, all of these, things that have come up through the pandemic, and how you've helped students, again, through this. And then with an eye towards the college planning process, maybe how has that sort of come into all of this as well?
I think that we learned through this whole process that one size does not fit all. It really doesn't. And I think that what the transition from in-person to online to in-person again has proven that it works for some and doesn't work for others. And so the traditional institutions, and I'm looking at high schools, very traditional in a lot of ways, and sometimes a lot of colleges are very protective of their traditions as well. But unfortunately, we're asking our kids who are not living conventional lives to fit into a tradition. And so we have to try and figure out how to diversify and individualize as much as we possibly can, so that we can figure out, what are the access points for these students to be able to be successful. And so my hopes is that through this whole process that we've learned that if we can start breaking some of these traditions and start evolving them. I don't want to get rid of them outright, because I think that some things are great to hold on to as a foundation that works for the institutions and are prideful things to hold on to. But at the same time, I think that we can evolve so that we can be more inclusive of all students and recognize that some students need online because there has such social anxieties that are happening that particularly over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, that it's working for some kids, for some students, where other students need that social engagement. I've had a number of students who were doing horribly during the pandemic, and then we were allowed for the last 2 months of school to open things up, and I opened things up for those students specifically who were not doing well online, and they came in and they became rock stars once again. And so we learned from that experience that we really have to individualize as much as we can for all students, and we want to make sure that we learn from this whole experience to be more inclusive and not just hold on to traditions that don't work for all students.
Great. Let me invite in Mandy. Leah?
Well, I appreciate framing this discussion as not all of our work needs to get students to behave differently, because I think the thing we've learned is that our institutions don't work for our students. And too often, particularly in the area of development, we identify students and what they don't have. First students who are first in their family to go to college lack this, or their families lack that. And I think that what we've learned is that the pandemic has put a spotlight on systems that did not work well, and on many of the inefficiencies in our systems. And I'll talk about school counseling as one area, because in the area of college counseling and college readiness, school counselors are largely charged with doing that work. And what we found in our research is that when we talk to the counselors, who again, they're the ones in schools who are primarily charged with supporting students' early college awareness, whether it's a 2-year, a 4-year school, or even a post-secondary credential, that they were really constrained in their efforts. This is not new. This has been going on for many, many years. Some schools are still using the outdated guidance model from the 1950s, where counselors are largely providing guidance, as opposed to really integrated counseling support. And what we found is that counselors were pulled in 100 different directions, from everything from temperature checks to making sure students were getting technology. And what we learned from counselors is that their expertise in both mental health and post-secondary planning was really needed at this time. And so what I hope is happening, to the point that Richard's bringing up around how we change our institutions, we need to think differently about making sure our counselors are available to students, that they have time to talk with families, that our students' schedules are designed in a way that students have time to talk with their counselors. Too often, the students will say, my counselor looks so busy, I don't want to bother her. And yet the reality is that for students who are needing extra support in schools, and what I mean by that are students whose families are not paying extra funds for private college counselors, et cetera, those students rely heavily on their schools, their teachers, and their counselors. And so we need to make sure those systems are set up well to provide that support, because when they can't, then we start to see those trends in enrollment that you talked about at the beginning. And so if we want to make sure that the doors to higher education remain open, particularly for those students who've been most marginalized, we have to look at the professionals in the schools who are most suited to do the work and make sure they're positioned to do their job well. And I think that we have to be willing to think differently about where we dedicate our time. I imagine those joining us today from K-12 know that schools put an inordinate amount of pressure on making sure that there's time for academics, because that's what schools are largely held accountable for. But we now know that if students are hungry or are not well, there's threats to their mental health, or they do not envision a future for themselves, the academics won't happen. So I just am very hopeful that we are going to make our way, whether it's through the additional funds, through the ESSER funds or CARES money, that we are going to do things differently, that we're going to prioritize the things that we know matter and we always espouse to matter, but maybe we haven't always put into action.
And Mandy, would you just mind just talking a little bit more about the ESSER and CARES funds, just so for those in the audience who are not familiar with those terms?
Sure. School districts around the country, and I expect Richard could share what they're doing, have been asked to figure out how they're going to spend these additional funds that are being given to states and school districts to recover, to address what some people identify as learning loss, others identify just as a need to strengthen relationships that have struggled during this time. But really what it means is that schools can look at doing things differently. We know we have new demands on schools. Schools have long shouldered the burdens of society. And that's, for the reasons that we've talked about earlier that relate to poverty, schools are being asked to do more. They opened and we're dealing during COVID with much more than many of other institutions. And so these funds are available for schools to hire more counselors, to hire social workers, to provide summer enrichment academies. And I think now the onus is on schools and districts to use that money wisely.
Yeah, if I could jump in real fast, because Mandy brought up a really great point. And I'm thank you for connecting your answer with mine, because As part of the American Rescue Plan, we received additional funds, and it was a lot of focus here in Philadelphia to provide that support to schools for operational purposes in preparation for students to return back to school. I redirected those funds and put in for a second counselor. I'm a small school, about 300 students, but unfortunately in Philadelphia, the ratio is like one counselor for every three to 400 students, which is almost impossible to do when you think about all the trauma and things that you have to support, as well as post-secondary planning. And so I thought it was important to redirect those funds to do something different and support additional counselor in the building, because our kids needed that support in the transition. And I'm so glad that I did that. So Mandy makes an amazing point, how we have to start breaking traditions and start using this money wisely and change how we do things in order to support students.
So let me actually now, I want to direct one more question. I think, Leah, I'd like to direct it towards you, and then we'll go to some audience Q&A. So Leah, you earlier said in one of your comments about the importance of partnerships between higher ed and K-12. So can you talk a little bit from the post-secondary perspective, what are you seeing with students coming in, and what are some ways that, K-12 and higher ed can work more effectively together to provide supports for these students?
Absolutely. So, I think the descriptions that Richard and Mandy have given about what students are facing, we're seeing the same things. We're seeing them a couple years later, right? We're working with overlapping populations, but we're not aligning our systems or working together to support them holistically. And that's profoundly challenging, because we're all very busy. In many ways, we're under-resourced, and we're trying to solve the problem in front of us. And I think to Mandy's point and Richard's point, we have to articulate our values with our time. And we have to make space for talking to students, and we have to make space for talking with each other. And while that can sometimes feel like a divergence from what needs to get done, the work is stronger and the relationships are deeper, and students are better served when we make space for it. So one thing that we're doing on our campus is, over the last month, we held close to 40 focus groups with different groups of students to hear about their experiences. And it was really interesting because it validated some of the things we knew were going on, and it gave us a lot of insights into things we were missing, because we hadn't stopped problem solving long enough to really listen to students' experiences holistically. So that has really mattered. And I think one of the places where we really have to focus are in those transition points. That's usually where we have exit points with students: the transition into college, the transition from being a new student and engaged in first year experience to selecting a major and being affiliated with a program of study. We have to be intentional and careful where we dedicate our time, and those transition points are what we're seeing on our campus really matter. One of the things we're doing that I think has seen, tremendous success across the country, and we're starting to see a lot of success with it locally, is early college. Thinking about how to partner effectively with our high school partners to develop curricular pathways that accelerate student progress. All the challenges that we've described so far, I saw in my work before the pandemic. But I think it's clear that they have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and they are disproportionately impacting the students who already faced the most challenges. And I think the good news is there are a lot of practices that work in accelerating student progress and supporting them. And we have to make bold choices to double down on those high impact, effective practices. And I think it requires a real rethinking, to Richard and Mandy's points about some of the traditions and some of the assumptions that have underlined our work that really need to be shaken. And I just want to make one last point, which is that it's not as simple as it was working before the pandemic and it's not working now, or one thing worked for everybody. Some students thrive in online learning. Some students really struggled in online learning. And I think we have to do some careful analysis of how to carry forward the best of what was working in a really, I would say, a matrix approach of really identifying who the student populations are, what seems to work best for them, and to carry forward those things. I've heard a lot of conversation of, I can't wait till we go back. And I don't think backwards is the direction we want to go in, but we also don't want to throw out everything we've learned over the last 2 years. And I think that takes kind of rolling up our sleeves, looking at disaggregated data on student success, and really pinpointing what seems to be working so that we can build upon that going forward.
Great, thank you. So I want to turn to a few questions from our audience members. So we have a few parents out there, and there's an interesting question from a parent about the stress level and worries that parents are feeling. So what can we say to parents about how to best support their students as they worry over their futures and their kids' futures?
As a parent on this call, I certainly understand there's always an opportunity for stress as a parent, but I think I just want to name something that is very real right now, and that is higher education admissions is a changing landscape. The test optional policies that have come to be over the last 2 years, in many ways are a step towards much more racial and socioeconomic equity. However, it's meant that the process that many people have understood is changing. And I think that can create more stress, but we have to remember that this is a step in the right direction as a society. What that means is that parents need to remember that this is not a race, that your role is to support your child and to set the tone and help them discover their sense of purpose and what it is that they really want to do, and not sort of buy into what institution is going to be the institution for them, but really talk about what's important to them, trying to tap into their values and who they want to be. I think it's interesting, as is true with other sort of pandemic prompted things, we're being forced to ask hard questions. We've been in a race when it comes to the admissions process. We saw that with the Varsity Blues scandal, that we were, this was not a system that was fair and equal. And I think that now, as we step back as parents, we need to remind our students that pursuing post-secondary education is an opportunity to dive deeper into things you love and want to learn about. And there is an institution for you. And be really, really broad in how we talk about post-secondary institutions. But understand that's stressful. The folks in schools are equally confused about how to navigate this new learning environment and the new admissions requirements. So what I would say to our school leaders out there is that your counselors need more professional development. To the admission folks on the call today, it's important that you talk with your counselors, explain to them how you're evaluating students differently, because unless both folks, both in K-12 and higher ed, really have a shared understanding of what admissions looks like, then students will not benefit. So I think that's an important step.
So,
I would imagine you got a few parents you're dealing with every now and then. You want to weigh in on that too?
Well, can I humble brag just for a quick second?
Humble brag, come on, bring it.
No, and I say it with all seriousness. I tell everyone I graduated from a small historically Black college here in Pennsylvania, and now I have one of the best schools in the city and National Principal of the Year. And I came from poverty, growing up in Camden, New Jersey. And what I always explain to my students is that we have to stop comparing ourselves to everyone else and really start focusing on what's best for us. And I think that a lot of the stress that comes with a lot of our families and our students is that we so want something that's name recognition versus identifying exactly what's the best fit for us financially and also logistically. And I think that, I always tell our families, it's so important for you to research and identify that, that you're not going to be any more or any less of a success by going to institution A rather than going to institution B, even if you know the institution B is better for you and it's a better fit for you. So that those are the things, unfortunately, while we are making these very challenging choices, we have to make the best choices. And when we're making choices for the wrong reasons, and without that lack of research, and Mandy said it best, how do we get that collaboration between high schools and admissions officers and have these very open and frank conversations and tell our families the importance of picking what's best for us? And I'm not comparing myself to John, who sits next to me, because he's going to Harvard. I'm going to go somewhere where it's going to be best fit for me, so that I can make sure that not only do I get in, but I have a plan for finishing. And that will eliminate a lot of the stressors and the trauma that a lot of our students are experiencing and our families are experiencing, because when our students go to places where it's not the best fit for them. And that's where the challenge and the stress comes for our families as well, because they're trying to figure out, how do I make the tuition bill? How with my limited resources, am I going to be able to get to my child or get them back home if they're flying back and forth, or they live there? It's a 6-hour ride from where they have to go to school. Like, we have to actually have these very frank conversations, and we have them with our students all the time. And I think that that's something that our parents can really do about, the matriculation to college, and also how students can survive in college with as little with less stress as possible.
Great. And Leah, we have about 1 minute left. Is there anything you want to say out there to the parents of students who are newly starting in college for that population?
I think there's a lot of stress on students and families to make the right choices. And, to Mandy and Richard's point, there is no right choice. And even if you make the wrong choice, there are ways to make left turns. And I think that that's what we need to focus on in higher education is pathways for students that allow for exploration, that allow for growth and development, and that are flexible. And so I think there's a lot of emphasis on, will this degree create a career that will pay back economically for what we're investing in college? And I think there are ways to expose students to work-based learning and different fields in ways that don't allow them any credit loss when they change their mind. And we have to remember, many of us are not doing what we thought we would do at 14, 15, 18, 25, 40. We've all changed and evolved. And we need to allow students opportunities to make those choices. And we need to work on our system so that they are more flexible, so that students don't experience loss when they decide to go in a new direction.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody who joined us this afternoon out in the audience. I hope that you found some of this conversation to be helpful and inspirational to the work that you're doing. And I want to give a special thanks to our panelists today, Leah Escalera, Richard Gordon, and Mandy Savitz-Romer. Thank you so much for your time. And most importantly, thank you so much for your great work. Folks in the audience, you'll see up on the screen some key takeaways from our discussion today. And you can certainly go to the Education Now website where you can access them as well. So on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, thank you everybody and have a good rest of your day.